"These rings," Mrs. Whitmore said through her tears, holding up the jewelry box with trembling hands that could barely maintain their grip, were wedding rings. "My husband and I had them specially made when we married 29 years ago. They were custom designed by a jeweler in Ireland, based on my grandmother's family crest. There are only 2 of them in the entire world." Sarah eventually did decide to leave her job at the nursing home, but not before she and Margaret worked together to establish a charitable trust that would significantly improve conditions for residents and staff. It felt important to give back to the place where they had found each other, and Margaret was eager to support any cause that mattered to her daughter. "This place brought us together," Margaret said as they toured the facility with the administrators, discussing plans for renovations and program improvements. "It deserves to be a place where other families can find healing too." The trust they established would fund major improvements to the facility, new medical equipment, better staffing ratios, enhanced recreational programs, and a complete renovation of the living spaces. Sarah insisted on being actively involved in the planning process, using her years of experience working there to identify the areas where improvements would have the most impact. The most difficult part of the adjustment was learning to accept love and generosity without suspicion or guilt. Sarah had been self-reliant for so long that accepting help, even from her own mother, felt foreign and uncomfortable. She had grown up believing that she needed to earn love through good behavior and usefulness, and it was difficult to accept that Margaret loved her simply for existing. "You don't have to do anything to deserve my love," Margaret told her during one of their many heart-to-heart conversations. "You don't have to be perfect, you don't have to make up for lost time, you don't have to prove anything to me. I love you because you're my daughter, period. That's unconditional and forever." Margaret was endlessly patient with Sarah's emotional struggles, understanding that trust would need to be built slowly. She never pressured Sarah to make decisions about money or lifestyle changes, instead allowing her daughter to set the pace for their relationship and their future together. As the months passed, they developed routines and traditions that helped them build the foundation of a relationship that should have been developing over decades. They had Sunday brunches together, during which Margaret would share stories about her childhood and her parents, Sarah's grandparents, who had died before Sarah could meet them. They took cooking classes together, since neither of them had much experience in the kitchen. They traveled to places Margaret had always wanted to visit but had never enjoyed alone. The most meaningful tradition they developed was their evening walks in Margaret's garden. Margaret had purchased a beautiful estate in the hills outside the city, complete with formal gardens that she had maintained even during her darkest years because they reminded her of the home where she had planned to raise Sarah. Every evening, they would walk among the roses and discuss their days, their hopes, their memories. "I planted these roses the year you were born," Margaret told Sarah one evening as they stood before a particularly beautiful section of the garden. "I had this vision of teaching you how to care for them, of watching you play among the flower beds. Even after I thought you were gone, I couldn't bring myself to remove them. They were the only connection I had left to the dreams I'd had about being your mother." Sarah found these evening conversations to be the most healing part of their reunion. In the garden, surrounded by beauty and the gentle sounds of nature, she could finally begin to process the magnitude of what had happened to them and start to envision a future that included the mother she had always dreamed of having. One of the most complex aspects of their reunion was dealing with Sarah's adoptive family, the Martinez clan. When Sarah finally told them about finding her biological mother, their reaction was a mixture of happiness for her and obvious discomfort about the implications of her newfound wealth and status. "We always knew you came from somewhere else," Carmen Martinez told her during a tense family dinner. "But we raised you as our own. We hope you won't forget that." Sarah assured them that she would never forget their kindness in taking her in, but the relationship was inevitably changed by her new circumstances. The Martinez family had always made it clear that Sarah was different, that she didn't quite belong, and now the reasons for that difference were starkly apparent. Sarah tried to maintain connections with them, but the gulf between their worlds had become too wide to bridge easily. Margaret, for her part, was grateful to the Martinez family for caring for Sarah during the years when she couldn't, and she made sure they were financially rewarded for their kindness. She established college funds for their children and paid off their mortgage, but she was careful not to make them feel like she was buying their continued presence in Sarah's life. "They gave you love when you needed it most," Margaret told Sarah. "I will always be grateful to them for that, even if our relationship with them is complicated now." The most challenging emotional work for both women was learning to grieve for the years they had lost while simultaneously celebrating the miracle of their reunion. Margaret had to process nearly 3 decades of believing her daughter was dead, while Sarah had to mourn the mother she had never known while getting to know the mother she now had. They both entered therapy, separately and together, to help them navigate the complex emotions of their situation. The therapist, Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, specialized in family reunification and helped them understand that their grief was not only normal but necessary. "You both suffered a profound trauma," Dr. Rodriguez explained during one of their joint sessions. "You lost each other in the most devastating way possible, through deception and deliberate separation. It's important to acknowledge that trauma and work through it, rather than trying to pretend it didn't happen just because you found each other now." The therapy helped them understand that their reunion wasn't just a happy ending, it was also the beginning of a long healing process that would take time and patience from both of them. 6 months after their reunion, Margaret made a decision that surprised even Sarah. She announced that she was going to sell most of her business holdings and focus entirely on philanthropy and spending time with her daughter. "I've spent 30 years building wealth for its own sake," Margaret explained. "Now I want to spend whatever time I have left using that wealth to make a difference in the world, especially for families who have been separated like we were." Together, they established the Elena Foundation, named after the daughter Margaret had lost and found again. The foundation focused on helping families separated by conflict, poverty, or deception to reunite and rebuild their relationships. They funded family reunification services, DNA testing programs for adoptees, and support groups for parents of missing children. The work gave both women a sense of purpose that went beyond their personal happiness. They were taking their own tragedy and using it to help others avoid or overcome similar losses. Sarah found the work incredibly fulfilling, using her natural empathy and her personal experience to help other families navigate the complex emotions of reunion and recovery. One of their first major cases involved a woman named Rosa Martinez, no relation to Sarah's adoptive family, who had been separated from her daughter during immigration proceedings 15 years earlier. Through the foundation's resources and connections, they were able to reunite Rosa with her daughter, who had been living with relatives in another state under a different name. Watching them embrace for the first time in 15 years, Sarah told Margaret afterward, "Reminded me of how I felt when I first realized who you were. It's like watching someone come back to life." The foundation work also helped Sarah process her own complicated feelings about her father. Working with families dealing with deception and separation made her understand that while what her father had done was inexcusable, it had come from a place of deep emotional pain rather than malice. Hurt people," she told Margaret one day as they reviewed applications for foundation assistance. "I'm not excusing what he did, but I'm starting to understand that he was acting out of his own trauma rather than pure cruelty." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "I've come to similar conclusions. It doesn't make what he did right, but it makes it more human, somehow. And focusing on helping other families means we're creating something positive from our pain." As their first year together progressed, both women began to heal in ways they hadn't expected. Margaret, who had been preparing to die alone and forgotten, found new energy and purpose in her role as Sarah's mother and in their shared philanthropic work. Sarah, who had spent her entire adult life struggling just to survive, discovered talents and interests she had never had the luxury to explore. "I want to go back to school," Sarah told Margaret one evening as they walked in the garden. "I never got to finish my education properly because I was too busy working. I think I'd like to study social work or counseling, so I can be more effective in our foundation work." Margaret's face lit up with pride and excitement. "Whatever you want to study, wherever you want to go, we'll make it happen. I've been hoping you'd want to continue your education." Sarah enrolled in a prestigious university's social work program, something that would have been financially impossible for her just a year earlier. Margaret attended her graduation 4 years later, crying tears of pride as her daughter received her master's degree with highest honors. The graduation was particularly meaningful because it represented not just Sarah's academic achievement, but the completion of dreams that had been deferred for decades by financial necessity. Margaret had missed Sarah's high school graduation, her community college courses, and every other milestone of her educational journey. Being present for this one felt like a small victory against the years they had lost. By their second year together, they had developed the easy intimacy of a mother and daughter who had known each other all their lives. They could communicate with glances across a room, finish each other's sentences, and anticipate each other's needs in the way that only comes from deep familiarity and love. "Sometimes I forget that we've only known each other for 2 years, Sarah told Margaret one day. "It feels like you've been my mother forever." "That's because I have been your mother forever," Margaret replied. "I just wasn't able to act on it for most of your life." But the love was always there, waiting for the chance to express itself. The ring that had brought them together became a symbol of their enduring bond and the Foundation's mission. They had copies made for the women they helped reunite with their families, creating a network of mothers and daughters connected by shared experience and mutual support. Years later, when people asked Sarah about the secret to happiness and resilience, she would touch her ring and smile, remembering the day a simple piece of jewelry had revealed the greatest treasure of her life, a mother's love that had waited 28 years to come home. The nursing home where they had found each other was transformed by their Foundation's support into a model facility that other institutions came to study and emulate. A plaque in the lobby commemorated the Whitmore Family Foundation, but those who knew the real story understood that it represented something much more profound than charitable giving. It represented the triumph of love over deception, of hope over despair, of family bonds that proved stronger than time, distance, or even death itself. And in a world that often seemed designed to keep people apart, their reunion stood as testimony to the enduring power of love and the possibility that sometimes, against all odds, lost things can be found again. Margaret kept her promise to share her wealth with Sarah, but more importantly, she shared her heart, her time, and her dreams for the future. Sarah, who had spent her life believing she was an orphan with no history and no legacy, discovered that she was actually an heiress to something far more valuable than money, a mother's unconditional love and a family legacy of resilience and generosity. The foundation they built together eventually helped reunite over 1,000 families, each success a small victory against the forces that had once torn Margaret and Sarah apart. But their greatest achievement wasn't measured in numbers or dollars, it was the relationship they built together, day by day, conversation by conversation, shared experience by shared experience. In the end, the ring that had connected them across the decades became a symbol of hope for everyone they encountered. It proved that some bonds are too strong to be broken by time, distance, or even the most determined efforts to sever them. And it reminded them daily that the most beautiful transformations often begin with the simplest recognition of love that has been waiting patiently to be claimed. Their story became a beacon of hope for other families torn apart by circumstances beyond their control, proof that it's never too late for love to find its way home, and that sometimes the most profound miracles come disguised as the most ordinary moments, like a caregiver noticing a familiar piece of jewelry on an elderly patient's finger and having the courage to ask a simple question that would change everything. S. knees gave out completely, and she collapsed back into her chair, her mind reeling as she tried to process the magnitude of what she was hearing. "You're saying you're but that's impossible. My mother died in childbirth. That's what they told me. That's what I've believed my entire life. Your father told everyone you died, Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice breaking as decades of suppressed grief finally found their way to the surface. When we divorced, when he discovered my affair, he took you and disappeared. He told me, he told everyone, that you had died of complications from an illness when you were just a few months old. I searched for years, hired private investigators, spent literally millions of dollars trying to find any trace of you. But he had covered his tracks too well." The room seemed to be spinning around Sarah as her entire understanding of her life crumbled like a house built on sand. Everything she had believed about herself, about her origins, about the woman who had given birth to her, all of it had been a carefully constructed lie. Why would he do that? Why would he lie about something so horrible? Because he wanted to hurt me in the worst way possible, her mother replied, her voice thick with decades of suppressed grief and rage. And he succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Losing you, thinking you were dead, destroyed me completely. It ended my marriage, my career, my ability to form relationships with other people. I threw myself into my business because it was the only thing that didn't require me to feel human emotions. Sarah looked down at the ring on her finger, her mother's ring, and suddenly understood why she had always felt such a deep, inexplicable connection to it. It wasn't just a random piece of jewelry from a stranger, it was a piece of her mother's heart, carried with her unknowingly for nearly 3 decades. How did you end up here? Sarah asked, gesturing around the nursing home with a hand that shook almost as badly as her mother's. If you're wealthy enough to hire private investigators and search for years, why are you in a place like this? Margaret's smile was heartbreakingly sad, the expression of someone who had given up on happiness long ago. Because I was waiting to die, darling. I had no family, no one to leave my fortune to, no reason to continue living. I chose this place because it felt real, not like the sterile luxury facilities where rich people go to die alone among their possessions. I wanted to be somewhere with actual human warmth in my final years, even if I couldn't participate in it myself. But you're not dying, Sarah protested, her voice rising with desperation. You're healthy, you're still young enough to have years ahead of you. I've been dying inside for 28 years, Margaret interrupted gently but firmly. Ever since I lost you. I built a business empire worth over $200 million, acquired properties in 12 countries, sat on the boards of major corporations, but what's the point of any of it when you have no one to share it with? What's the point of success when the only person you ever truly loved is gone? Sarah felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. Not only was her mother alive and sitting right in front of her, but she was incredibly wealthy and had spent nearly 3 decades grieving for a daughter she thought was dead. The irony was almost too much to bear. She had been struggling financially for years while her mother, just a few miles away, had more money than she could spend in several lifetimes. What happens now? Sarah asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the sound of both women's quiet crying. Margaret reached out with shaking hands and took Sarah's face gently between her palms, as if she were afraid her daughter might disappear if she didn't hold on tight enough. Now we have a second chance that I never dared to hope for. I want to get to know my daughter. I want to hear about your life, your childhood, your dreams, your struggles. I want to learn everything about the person you've become. And I want to try to make up for all the years we lost, even though I know that's impossible. I don't know how to do this, Sarah admitted, fresh tears streaming down her face. I don't know how to have a mother. I don't know how to be someone's daughter. I've been on my own for so long that I don't even know what it feels like to have family. We'll figure it out together, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion but also with a determination Sarah had never heard from her before. We have all the time in the world now. We can take it as slowly as you need to. There's no pressure, no timeline, no expectations except that we try to build something beautiful out of this miracle. Over the following days, Sarah learned the full, devastating story of her mother's life since their separation. Margaret Whitmore, whose real name was Margaret Elena Rosewood, giving Sarah another shock when she realized they shared the same middle name, had built her fortune in commercial real estate development. She had started with a single small property that she had purchased with money from her divorce settlement and had built it into a multi-million-dollar empire through a combination of shrewd business instincts and a work ethic born of desperation. The private investigator reports that Margaret showed her filled several boxes in a storage unit that Margaret maintained specifically for that purpose. Every lead had been followed, every possibility explored, every potential trace investigated with the thoroughness that only unlimited resources could provide. Sarah's father, whose name had been David Chen, had been more clever than Margaret had given him credit for. He had changed their names multiple times, moved across the country in a seemingly random pattern, and had eventually placed Sarah with the Martinez family through a private adoption arrangement that had left no paper trail. The most heartbreaking part for Sarah was learning about the lengths to which her mother had gone to try to find her. Margaret had hired teams of private investigators, offered substantial rewards for information, and had even gone so far as to fund missing children's organizations in the hope that it might somehow lead to information about her own lost daughter. She had appeared on television shows about missing persons, had worked with police departments across the country, and had never given up hope until the day she had decided to enter the nursing home. The hardest part, Margaret told her one afternoon as they sat in her room going through photo albums and documents that chronicled her search, was not knowing whether you were dead or alive, whether you were safe or in danger, whether you were happy or suffering. The not knowing was worse than any pain I had ever experienced. At least if I had known you were dead, I could have grieved properly and tried to move on. But the uncertainty kept me trapped in a kind of limbo for decades. Sarah learned that her father had died in a car accident when she was 15 years old, taking the truth about her identity with him to his grave. By that time, she had been living with the Martinez family for over 14 years and had no memory of her life before them. The timing was particularly cruel. If David had lived just a few more years, he might have eventually told Sarah the truth about her mother, or Margaret's investigators might have been able to track him down. "Do you hate him?" Sarah asked one day, referring to her father. "For what he did to both of us?" Margaret was quiet for a long time before answering. "I did, for many years. The hatred was so consuming that it was like a poison in my system. But eventually, I realized that holding on to that anger was only hurting me, not him. He was already gone, and my hatred couldn't bring you back or change what had happened. So I tried to let it go, for my own sanity. But what he did was unforgivable," Sarah said, her own anger rising on her mother's behalf. "He robbed us of 28 years together. He made you think your only child was dead. He denied me the chance to know my real mother. How can you not hate him for that?" "Because hate is a burden I can't afford to carry anymore," Margaret replied gently. "And because, despite everything, he did raise you for the first few years of your life. You were clearly loved and cared for by the Martinez family, and you grew up to be an extraordinary person despite all the challenges you faced. Maybe, in his twisted way, he thought he was protecting you from me." "Protecting me from what?" Sarah asked, confused. Margaret's expression grew pained. "From the scandal of my affair, from having a mother who had betrayed her marriage vows. Your father was a good man in many ways, just deeply hurt and angry. When he discovered that I had been unfaithful, it destroyed something fundamental in him. Maybe he convinced himself that you would be better off without me." The conversation about her father's motivations was difficult for Sarah to process. She had spent her entire life believing that both of her biological parents were dead, and learning not only that her mother was alive but that her father had deliberately kept them apart was almost too much to comprehend. She found herself cycling through emotions: grief for the lost years, anger at her father's deception, guilt for not somehow figuring out the truth sooner, and overwhelming joy at having found her mother. Margaret was patient with Sarah's emotional roller coaster, understanding that this reunion was perhaps even more overwhelming for her daughter than it was for her. At least Margaret had known that Sarah existed somewhere in the world. Sarah had to completely restructure her understanding of her own identity and history. The practical aspects of their reunion were almost as complex as the emotional ones. Margaret insisted on hiring financial advisors to help Sarah understand the implications of suddenly having access to substantial wealth. Sarah learned that her mother intended to transfer half of her remaining assets to her immediately, an amount that totaled over $100 million, with the remainder coming to her eventually through inheritance. "I don't want you to have to worry about money ever again," Margaret explained during one of their many long conversations. "I want you to have the freedom to pursue whatever makes you happy, whether that's continuing to work here because you love it, or going back to school, or traveling the world, or starting your own business. Money should be a tool that gives you options, not a source of stress." The transition wasn't easy for Sarah. She had been self-reliant for so long that accepting help, even from her own mother, felt strange and uncomfortable. Margaret was patient, understanding that trust would need to be built slowly and that Sarah would need time to adjust to having someone in her life who genuinely cared about her well-being. More challenging was learning to navigate their relationship as adults who were essentially strangers despite their biological connection. Margaret had missed every milestone of Sarah's life: first steps, first words, first day of school, graduations, heartbreaks, achievements, failures. They had no shared memories, no inside jokes, no common experiences to build on. They were starting from scratch, trying to create a mother-daughter relationship that should have been developing over nearly 3 decades. But they were both committed to making it work. Margaret scaled back her few remaining business activities to focus entirely on spending time with Sarah. They took things slowly, meeting for a few hours each day at first, then gradually spending entire days together as they became more comfortable with each other. Sarah # the ring that revealed everything. The fluorescent lights of Sunset Manor nursing home flickered with their usual persistent hum as Sarah Chen pushed her cleaning cart down the long corridor. At 28, she had worked here for nearly 4 years, and the institutional smell of disinfectant and old memories had become as familiar as her own breath. Her fingers absently twisted the worn silver ring on her left hand, a nervous habit she developed over the years whenever she felt overwhelmed by life's relentless pressures. The ring was all she had left of her parents. According to her adoptive family, her mother had died in childbirth and her father shortly after in a car accident. The ring had supposedly belonged to her mother, passed down through generations, though Sarah often wondered if that story was true. The Martinez family, who had taken her in when she was just 6 months old, weren't known for their attention to detail when it came to uncomfortable truths. Sarah's life had never been easy. The Martinez family had been kind enough, but they'd made it clear she was a burden rather than a blessing. When she turned 18, they'd helped her find a small apartment and a job, but the message was clear: it was time to make her own way in the world. Since then, she'd been barely scraping by, working double shifts at the nursing home and taking on weekend cleaning jobs just to keep her head above water. "Sarah, Mrs. Whitmore in room 314 is asking for you specifically," called out Linda, the day shift supervisor. "She seems agitated and won't let anyone else help her." Mrs. Whitmore had been at Sunset Manor for about 2 years now, and she was what the staff quietly referred to as a difficult case. Not because she was mean or demanding, but because she was clearly wealthy enough to afford much better care elsewhere, yet she'd specifically chosen their modest facility. She paid for the premium suite but rarely left her room, spoke to almost no one, and seemed to carry a sadness so profound that it affected everyone around her. What made Mrs. Whitmore even more puzzling was her obvious intelligence and refinement. She spoke with the measured tone of someone accustomed to boardrooms and high-stakes decisions, yet she'd withdrawn from the world so completely that most days she barely acknowledged the staff's existence. Sarah had been assigned to her care rotation about 6 months ago, and for reasons she couldn't understand, Mrs. Whitmore had begun requesting her specifically. Sarah knocked gently on the door of room 314 before entering. The room was spacious compared to the standard accommodations, decorated with expensive furniture that Mrs. Whitmore had brought from her previous life. Original paintings hung on the walls, and fresh flowers, real ones, not the artificial arrangements most residents received, sat on every available surface. Mrs. Whitmore sat in her high-backed chair by the window, staring out at the garden below. She was an elegant woman in her early 60s, with silver hair that was always perfectly styled and clothes that whispered of designer labels. Even in the nursing home, she maintained an air of refined dignity that set her apart from the other residents. "You wanted to see me, Mrs. Whitmore?" Sarah asked softly, approaching with the gentle manner she'd learned to use with the more fragile residents. The older woman turned, and Sarah was struck, as she always was, by Mrs. Whitmore's eyes. They were a deep brown, almost black, and they held a combination of intelligence and deep sadness that seemed to reach right into Sarah's soul. There was something else there too, something Sarah couldn't quite identify but that made her feel oddly unsettled. "Please, sit with me for a moment," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice carrying the slight accent of someone who had spent years in international business circles. "I've been having a difficult day, and your presence always seems to calm me." Sarah settled into the chair across from her, setting aside her cleaning supplies. This wasn't unusual. Many of the residents simply needed human connection, and Sarah had learned that sometimes just sitting quietly with them was more valuable than any medical intervention. "Tell me about your family, dear," Mrs. Whitmore said suddenly, fixing Sarah with that intense gaze. "Do you have children? A husband?" Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. This was personal territory that she rarely ventured into with residents. "No, ma'am. I'm not married. No children." "What about your parents? Are they still alive?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She twisted her ring more frantically, feeling the familiar ache of loss and unanswered questions. "No, they both died when I was very young. I don't really remember them." Mrs. Whitmore's expression changed subtly, a flicker of something, pain? Recognition, crossing her features. "I'm sorry to hear that. It must be difficult, not having any connection to your past." "I have this ring," Sarah said without thinking, then immediately regretted the admission. She didn't usually share personal details with residents. "It belonged to my mother, supposedly. It's all I have left of her." Mrs. Whitmore's eyes fixed on Sarah's hand with laser-like intensity. "May I see it?" Sarah hesitated. The ring was her most precious possession, the only tangible link to her origins. But something in Mrs. Whitmore's tone compelled her to extend her hand. Mrs. Whitmore took Sarah's hand gently, studying the ring with an expression that grew increasingly strained. The ring was simple but distinctive, a silver band with an intricate Celtic knot design and a small emerald at the center. As Mrs. Whitmore examined it, her breathing became shallow and rapid. "Where did you say you got this?" Mrs. Whitmore's voice was barely above a whisper. "From my adoptive family. They said it belonged to my birth mother." Sarah was beginning to feel alarmed by Mrs. Whitmore's reaction. "Are you feeling all right? Should I call the nurse?" Instead of answering, Mrs. Whitmore reached over to her nightstand with trembling fingers and opened the top drawer. She pulled out a small velvet jewelry box and, with hands that shook visibly, opened it to reveal an identical ring. Sarah stared at the two rings, one on her finger, one in the box, as her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. The rings weren't just similar, they were exactly the same, down to the smallest detail of the Celtic knot pattern and the precise placement of the tiny emerald. "That's impossible," Sarah breathed, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Whitmore's face had gone completely white, and tears were beginning to stream down her cheeks. "What's your full name, dear? Your birth name?" "Sarah Elena Martinez," Sarah replied automatically, though she was beginning to feel like she was moving through a dream. "But Martinez is my adoptive name. I don't know what my birth name was." Mrs. Whitmore's sob was audible now, a sound of pure anguish that seemed to come from the deepest part of her soul. "Elena," she whispered. "I named you Elena." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stood up abruptly, knocking over her chair in the process. "What are you saying?" "These rings," Mrs. Whitmore said, holding up the jewelry box with trembling hands, "were wedding rings. My husband and I had them specially made when we married. I kept mine after everything fell apart. I thought you were dead. For 28 years, I thought you were dead." Sarah's knees gave out, and she sank back into her chair, her mind reeling. "You're saying you're but that's impossible. My mother died in childbirth. That's what they told me." "Your father told everyone you died," Mrs. Whitmore, her mother, said through her tears. "When we divorced, when he found out about my affair, he took you and disappeared. He told me you had died of complications from an illness. I searched for years, hired private investigators, spent fortunes trying to find any trace of you. But he had covered his tracks too well. The room seemed to be spinning around Sarah. Everything she had believed about her life, about her origins, was crumbling like a house of cards. Why would he do that? Why would he lie? Because he wanted to hurt me in the worst way possible, her mother replied, her voice thick with decades of suppressed grief. And he succeeded. Losing you destroyed me. I threw myself into my business, made millions, built an empire, but none of it mattered because I thought my daughter was dead. Sarah looked at the ring on her finger, her mother's ring, and suddenly understood why she had always felt such a deep connection to it. It wasn't just a random piece of jewelry from a stranger, it was a piece of her mother's heart, carried with her for nearly 3 decades. How did you end up here? Sarah asked, gesturing around the nursing home. If you're wealthy, why are you in a place like this? Her mother's smile was heartbreakingly sad. Because I was waiting to die, darling. I had no family, no one to leave my fortune to. I chose this place because it felt real, not like the sterile luxury facilities where rich people go to die alone. I wanted to be somewhere with actual human warmth in my final years. But you're not dying, Sarah protested. You're healthy, you're still young enough to. I've been dying inside for 28 years, her mother interrupted gently. Ever since I lost you. I built a business empire worth over $200 million, but what's the point of wealth when you have no one to share it with? Sarah felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. Not only was her mother alive, but she was incredibly wealthy. More importantly, though, she had spent nearly 3 decades grieving for a daughter she thought was dead. What happens now? Sarah asked quietly. Her mother reached out and took her hands, holding them as if she were afraid Sarah might disappear. Now we have a second chance. I want to get to know my daughter. I want to hear about your life, your dreams, your struggles. And I want to make up for all the years we lost. I don't know how to do this, Sarah admitted. I don't know how to have a mother. We'll figure it out together, her mother said, squeezing her hands gently. We have all the time in the world now. Over the following days, Sarah learned the full story of her mother's life. Margaret Whitmore, her real name was Margaret Elena Rosewood, had built her fortune in commercial real estate, starting with a single property and expanding into a multi-million-dollar empire. She had never remarried after Sarah's father, never had other children, and had spent the better part of 3 decades searching for any trace of the daughter she thought was dead. The private investigator reports filled several boxes in Margaret's apartment. Every lead had been followed, every possibility explored, but Sarah's father had changed their names, moved across the country, and eventually placed Sarah with the Martinez family before disappearing entirely. He had died in a car accident when Sarah was 15, taking the truth with him to his grave. Margaret's decision to enter the nursing home hadn't been about needing care, it had been about giving up. She had liquidated most of her business holdings, set up various charitable trusts, and prepared to spend her remaining years in quiet solitude. Finding Sarah had changed everything. I need to ask you something, Margaret said one afternoon as they sat in her room, going through photo albums from Sarah's childhood that she had somehow never seen. I know this is overwhelming, and I know you have your own life. I don't want to pressure you into anything, but I'd like you to come and live with me. I have a house, several houses, actually, and I'd love to have you close while we get to know each other. Sarah had been expecting this conversation, but it still felt surreal. A week ago, she had been struggling to pay rent on a 1-bedroom apartment, working double shifts just to survive. Now she was being offered a life of comfort beyond her wildest dreams. What about my job? She asked practically. You can quit tomorrow if you want, Margaret replied. Or if you love working here, you can continue. I'll support whatever decision you make. But you'll never have to worry about money again, darling. I'm going to transfer half of my remaining assets to you immediately, and you'll inherit everything when I'm gone. The conversation about money felt almost secondary to the emotional reunion they were experiencing. Sarah had spent her entire life feeling like an outsider, like someone who didn't quite belong anywhere. Finding her mother, discovering that she came from love, even if that love had been tragically interrupted, changed something fundamental about how she saw herself. "There's something else," Margaret said quietly. "I never stopped loving your father, despite everything. What he did was cruel and unforgivable, but I understand why he did it. He was hurt and angry, and people do terrible things when they're in pain. I don't want you to hate him." Sarah had complicated feelings about the man she had never known. On one hand, he had robbed her of nearly 3 decades with her mother. On the other hand, he had apparently loved her enough to raise her himself, at least until her early childhood. "I don't think I'm capable of hating someone I never really knew," Sarah said honestly. "But I do hate what he did to you. To both of us." "Don't carry that burden," Margaret advised. "We can't change the past, but we can build a future together." The transition wasn't easy. Sarah had to navigate not only the emotional complexity of suddenly having a mother, but also the practical realities of sudden wealth. Margaret insisted on hiring financial advisors to help Sarah understand her new circumstances, but it would take time for the reality to sink in. More challenging was learning to navigate their relationship. Margaret had missed every milestone of Sarah's life: first steps, first words, first day of school, graduations, heartbreaks, achievements. They were essentially strangers who happened to share DNA and an incredible story. But they were both committed to making it work. Margaret scaled back her charitable activities to focus on spending time with Sarah. They traveled together, with Margaret showing Sarah places she had always wanted to visit but could never afford. They spent long evenings talking, sharing stories, and slowly building the foundation of a mother-daughter relationship that should have been built over decades. Sarah eventually did quit her job at the nursing home, but not before she and Margaret worked together to establish a trust that would significantly improve conditions for residents and staff. It felt important to give back to the place where they had found each other. The most difficult part of the adjustment was learning to accept love and generosity without suspicion. Sarah had been self-reliant for so long that accepting help, even from her own mother, felt strange and uncomfortable. Margaret was patient, understanding that trust would need to be built slowly. 6 months after their reunion, Sarah stood in the garden of Margaret's estate, her estate now too, watching her mother tend to the roses she had planted in celebration of finding her daughter. The rings they both wore caught the sunlight, symbols of a love that had survived decades of separation and heartbreak. "Do you ever think about what might have been different?" Sarah asked as Margaret joined her on the garden bench. "Every day," Margaret replied honestly. "But I try to focus on what we have now instead of what we lost. We can't get those years back, but we can make the most of the years we have left." Sarah nodded, understanding what her mother meant. The pain of their lost time would always be there, but it was overshadowed by the miracle of their reunion and the promise of their future together. The nursing home where they had found each other was now a state-of-the-art facility, thanks to Margaret's generous donations. A plaque in the lobby commemorated the Whitmore Family Foundation, established in honor of love that transcends time and circumstance. But the real memorial to their story wasn't a plaque or a building, it was the relationship they were building together, one day at a time, one conversation at a time, one shared meal at a time. As the sun set over the garden, Sarah reached over and took her mother's hand, their matching rings touching for a moment. It was a simple gesture, but it represented everything they had lost and everything they had found. Sometimes the most profound miracles come disguised as ordinary moments. For Sarah and Margaret, that moment had been a simple conversation about a piece of jewelry in a nursing home room. But that conversation had revealed a truth that changed everything: love doesn't die, even when it's buried under decades of lies and loss. Their story proved that family isn't always about the time you spend together, sometimes it's about the love that endures even when everything else falls apart. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get a second chance to build the life that was stolen from you. Margaret kept her promise to share her wealth with Sarah, but more importantly, she shared her heart. And Sarah, who had spent her life believing she was an orphan with no history and no future, discovered that she was actually an heiress with a mother who had never stopped loving her. The ring that had connected them across the decades became a symbol of hope for both of them, proof that some bonds are too strong to be broken by time, distance, or even death. And in a world that often seems designed to keep people apart, their reunion stood as testimony to the enduring power of love and the possibility that sometimes, against all odds, lost things can be found again. Years later, when people asked Sarah about the secret to happiness, she would touch her ring and smile, remembering the day a simple piece of jewelry revealed the greatest treasure of her life, a mother's love that had waited 28 years to come home.